Hello, good evening, and welcome to the Institute for Human Sciences. Very special evening this evening, which we are holding the Geopolitical talk in conjunction with the Ministry of Defense of the Austrian Republic. So thank you very much to them. And our guest this evening is quite special, Professor Stephen Walt. I'm not going to introduce him. I'm leaving that to my esteemed colleague, permanent fellow Ivan Krastev. This is going to be a great event. Thanks very much for turning up.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have it. Thank you. Thank you. First, I can imagine that you're asking a question, who is organizing a lecture like this on the night of the American elections? And here's the answer. People said that almost everybody remembered what they did in the day when Kennedy was killed, and everybody remembered what they did on 9/11. So I want to make it easier for you to remember what happened on November 5. You know that basically you have been on a lecture of Professor Stephen Walt. Secondly, you're here not because you don't know who he is. You're here because you know who he is. So I'm not going to read basically his biography, but just three things that in my view are extremely important for our conversation. I'm not going to make basically just this kind of a normal compliments in the introduction if I'm going to say that he's one of the most prominent person in any discussions about foreign policy and international relations these days. Professor in Kennedy School in Harvard, he has been teaching in Chicago and other places. But when it comes to the realist theory, he is really one of the big names. So probably some of the colleagues, I see some students and so on, to the extent you know him as a textbook. But secondly, he's also one of the persons who is also very actively using his theory in order to interpret what is happening in the world today. And it was Robert Kaplan who recently said that in order to understand world events, you start with reading maps and you end up with reading Shakespeare. But between these two, probably you should read also Stephen Walt for a while. And the third thing is he's coming in a moment where I do believe, regardless of the result of the American elections, which are going to have an incredible difference how it's going, we are seeing in a period in which obviously the international order as we knew it after the end of the World War II, but particularly after the end of the Cold War, is going dramatically to change. And this is why, in my view, the question that he decided to answer, can we create a better world order, is one of the most important questions that we have. He's so transparent that even we know how he voted already, because he wrote a piece in the foreign policy saying, I'm a realist, but I'm going to vote for Harris. So now you know everything about him. Stephen, it's you.
Thank you, Ivan, for the introduction, and Misha for hosting me here this semester. I've been having a wonderful time, and I'm grateful to all of you for coming out. It's quite flattering to see the turnout. Now, I suspect everyone is really here because you want me to tell you who's going to win the election. And I'm willing to bet that most of you would like me to say that I'm sure it's going to be Kamala Harris. Unfortunately, I can't do that. So the best I can do right now is distract you for a while, get us all closer to the moment when we actually know the outcome, and then we can decide how to react. So, as the title suggests, I'm going to talk instead about world order. The existing world order that we've come to know, if not to love, is falling apart. I think everybody understands that. The need for a better one is obvious to just about everyone, but it's not obvious how we might create a better one without first having to go through a vast global struggle like World War I or World War II. And to explain how that goal could be achieved, I want to cover three broad topics. There we go. First, what is world order? What do we mean by this term that people like to throw around a lot? And then second, why do I think the present order is now collapsing? And then finally, how might key global actors go about creating a new one, again, without first having to go through some kind of cataclysmic global contest? Along the way, I will say a few words about the American position in the world, in that new world order, and the implications of the election. My suspicion is I'll get some questions about the latter eventually, and Yvonne will undoubtedly bring it up as well. So there are many definitions of world order. Most of them refer to a set of rules or institutions that define both who the principal actors are and help them manage their interactions with each other. So the late Hedley Bull famously defined international order as a group of states that conceive themselves to be bound by a set of common rules. John Mearsheimer, arch-realist, he even writes, an order is an organized group of international institutions that help govern the interactions among the member states. And he adds that institutions are rules that great powers devise and agree to follow because obeying those rules advances their interests. Henry Kissinger, also in his book World Order, says world orders rest in part, again, on a set of commonly accepted rules that define the limits of permissible action. Now, these definitions, and most of the ones you can read in textbooks, define or use territorial states to define the present world order. But of course, states aren't the only way we could organize political and social affairs. It's actually a rather modern development that it's become the universal political form. And of course, there are still some important entities out there, such as the European Union, that really aren't fully states. Second point I'd make about orders is that they invariably reflect the underlying balance of power. The strongest actors set and enforce the rules. Weaker actors mostly accept them, though they do push back on occasion. Stronger actors can also break or change the rules if they wish, but doing this has costs. States that break the rules repeatedly, even if they're great powers, ultimately are seen as untrustworthy, dangerous. They're likely to face growing opposition over time. Moreover, repeated violations, even by the most powerful, undermine the legitimacy of the rules themselves and eventually lead more and more actors to start violating them as well. And as I'll say in a moment, I think that's pretty much where we are today. Significant shifts in the balance of power inevitably lead to alterations in an order, but those changes sometimes take a very long time to manifest themselves. The best example I can think of is the current composition of the United Nations Security Council, established in 1945, reflecting the distribution of power at that time and utterly obsolescent today. Why are Britain and France still permanent members with a veto, but not India, not Japan, et cetera, et cetera? Of course, that's the case because no one can agree on how to revise the Security Council, but it clearly doesn't reflect the current distribution of power. Last point on orders. They also reflect what John Ruggie called social purpose, the goals the actors are trying to achieve, and broader notions of right and wrong. Modern states aren't just in the business of providing security or serving a monarch's interests. They're expected to provide other benefits to their citizens, and they, of course, will prefer an order that helps them to do that. As you all know, the current world order was established more or less after World War II, based on the United Nations, the principle of the sovereign equality of states, self-determination, and then a whole series of laws and conventions regulating the use of force, managing the international economy, limiting access to weapons of mass destruction, and a whole series of other things. But even within that order, there were partial orders, one in the West, another in the communist world, based on very different rules and principles. And of course, then you had the non-aligned global South that was not fully part of either the communist order or the Western liberal order. After the Cold War, the United States tried to expand that Western order and make it a truly global liberal order, promoting globalization, democracy, and bringing the former communist countries into the World Trade Organization and other institutions that by and large had been created by the United States and its democratic allies. As I'll discuss later on, this attempt to create a global liberal order was a near total failure, which is one of the reasons we are in the situation we're in today. So here's why the current order is breaking down, in my view. First, the balance of power has shifted enormously. Economic power has been moving steadily toward Asia. China was 2% of the world economy 50 years ago. It's 18% today. India is rising. Meanwhile, the European Union has gone from 28% of the world economy to 14%, which, by the way, is the main reason why European influence is declining. The European Union used to be larger than the American economy, by the way. It's now 40% smaller, partly because Britain left, but also because productivity growth has been so low. And meanwhile, the United States has remained roughly where it's been all along. If you look at 1945 or 1992 as your baseline, America appears to be declining, but it's still roughly 24, 26% of the world economy. It's been growing more rapidly than the other major powers. The dollar remains the world's principal reserve currency. America's position in the international financial system gives it enormous leverage over other countries. American firms are still highly innovative. Its higher education system is still unmatched, despite my best efforts. And American cultural institutions still cast a large shadow over the rest of the world. A couple of more points. The United States has favorable demography relative to most of the other major powers. Its population is still increasing, and it's somewhat younger on average. Of course, its military advantages remain unmatched. We spend about twice as much as China on defense. We have all these bases, alliances, etc. No country could threaten to invade, conquer, blockade, or coerce the United States in any meaningful way. One final thing, the United States has an enormously favorable geography. It's the only great power in the Western Hemisphere. Every other great power has been attacked at home at some point in the last couple of hundred years. The last time the United States was attacked in the continental United States was the War of 1812, a war we foolishly started with our Canadian friends. This position gives the United States enormous latitude. Others want American help, but the United States is also in a position to cut its losses and go home whenever it decides things aren't working out well, and of course we've done that repeatedly. I mention all of this because this is why the American election matters. It is still the world's most powerful country, so what it does or what it doesn't do can make a huge difference. And the fragile condition of American institutions, the deep degree of political polarization that will play itself out today, may lead it to squander all of those advantages I just listed and do things that do enormous damage around the world, even if all it does is do nothing. Key point I want to remind you, though, is that the United States, regardless of what its future trajectory is going to have an enormous impact on whatever shape a future world order takes. I'll say a bit more about that, too. The final point I'd make here is just remember that the major powers in today's world have different interests, different set of values and objectives, including on some basic normative principles. So constructing an order that's broadly accepted and legitimate is going to be very difficult. So one big problem, the shifts in the balance of power. Second big problem, is climate change. I mean, we're just beginning to recognize and experience its impact in real time. It's going to get substantially worse, and I think this is going to have far-reaching social and political effects, even if all one thinks about is the amount of money it's going to take to either mitigate or adapt to climate change, which of course will eat up funding that might be available for other terms. So this will have an enormous effect throughout the world. A third problem, which I don't need to tell anyone in Europe, is migration. Wars, climate change, simply a desire for a better life is encouraging millions of people to move around the world, and modern transportation makes this a lot easier to do. But of course, every state still wants to control who comes in and who can remain, and there is no international consensus on how to manage this problem. Again, I don't need to remind any of you how important this phenomenon is politically, how it has shaped politics in many democracies, including the United States. Number 4, technology. I think we are in the midst of an explosion of revolutionary advances in biology, energy production, artificial intelligence, medicine, and technological revolutions always leave their mark on politics. Artificial intelligence alone is already affecting warfare, labor markets, education, and public attitudes. And again, there is no agreement, even among democratic allies, on how to regulate these technologies or manage their consequences. And then finally, we have an erosion of norms that made up the order of the past 75 years. However imperfectly these norms worked, I think they are now collapsing. The idea of open trade is giving way to growing protectionism around the world. The norm against territorial conquest is breaking down and was doing so even before the war in Ukraine. Genocides and mass killings are taking place in several places, and the major powers seem surprisingly indifferent to it. The reactions of the United States and Germany, for example, to what's been happening in Gaza simply astounds me and suggests that that norm against that never again sentiment that people had for many years rang rather hollow. Ideologies we thought were gone forever, such as fascism, are back. And politicians in democracies act now in ways that would have ended their careers 30 years ago, and they become more popular as a result. And I'm not just talking about Donald Trump. The United States, China, India, Russia, Europe all have very different ideas about personal privacy, basic human rights as well. And the point I really want to emphasize is that, all of these things are happening at the same time and very rapidly and reinforcing each other. So current institutions can't address all of them at once. The result is growing uncertainty, insecurity, and fear. Fear leads people to crave authority and order and encourages a lot of other bad behavior too. So that's why we're in trouble. So what can we do about it? I am sorry to say I do not have a fully developed blueprint for a better world order, but I have been working on a project on this topic, a multinational project conducted by the Quincy Institute in Washington. And my colleague at Harvard, Danny Roderick, and I have written several papers outlining an approach to building a better order. And here's a brief sketch of those ideas. First of all, what are the objectives we should be seeking here? I think there are four big ones. First, preserve the conditions for sustained human existence. All right, that's basically the climate change issue as well. Second, reduce the risk of major war. You can't drive it to zero, but we'd like it to be as low as possible. Third, manage the movement of goods, capital, information, and people. We have had existing regimes for the first three, not for the last one, right? And finally, promote basic human rights for all, although admittedly there are going to be differences among different countries on that particular, on what those rights actually ought to be. So those are our objectives. Here's why the United States, and for that matter the West, can't impose this unilaterally. To be broadly legitimate and acceptable, any new order has to recognize that China, Russia, India, Brazil, and many others are going to have a voice. And I said the United States is still very powerful, but it's not in the same position, say, it was in 1992 to contemplate the possibility of reshaping the entire order. This might actually be a good thing, because trying to create a liberal order based on American primacy didn't work very well. American Middle East policy has been a train wreck for the past 30 years, with the failure of the Oslo peace agreements, September 11th, the global war on terror, failed interventions in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Yemen, now Gaza. And of course, none of the officials responsible for this were ever held accountable for it. NATO enlargement did not create, unfortunately, a vast zone of peace in Europe. On the contrary, it poisoned relations with Russia, drove Russia and China closer together, and eventually led Moscow to launch an illegal war, seizing Crimea and invading the rest of Ukraine in 2022. Europe is less secure today, and US policy is not the only reason for that, but it's part of the explanation. The financial crisis of 2008 and the consequences of hyperglobalization cast doubt on American judgment the masters of the universe on Wall Street didn't seem quite so masterful. It also discredited the neoliberal model and fueled populism on both sides of the Atlantic. Efforts to spread democracy also failed. In fact, according to The Economist and Freedom House both, democracy has been in retreat worldwide for 20 years and, of course, is now under siege in the United States. The lesson I would sort of conclude from all of this is, hang on, did I? Oh. Oops, sorry. If any state seeks to impose a new order unilaterally, and certainly one based on its primacy, prospects for a better order are bleak, and we'll essentially end up with a pure realist world with relatively few rules regulating what states do. All right, next, what are the issues that a new order has to address? Well, I'd say the following. First, reforming the UN system and other key global institutions. Second, developing some new rules for global trade and investment, somewhere in between the hyper-globalization of the 1990s and today's trend towards protectionism. Third, we need to rethink the laws of war. When and how can force be used? These norms began to be relaxed greatly during the global war on terror. Governments began engaging in targeted killings, in preventive war, things like that, the assassination of public officials, something for which there had actually been fairly strong norms against prior to that. I think we are going to need to redefine and reassert those norms regulating what the legitimate use of force is. We will need to strengthen regimes governing the building and use of weapons of mass destruction. We will need some norms to regulate artificial intelligence, including autonomous weapons, but also cyber warfare. And last but not least, of course, climate. So how do we get there? This brings me to the shamelessly idealistic glass half full part of my talk. As I said at the outset, major order-building moments in the past always occurred after major wars. After the Napoleonic Wars, you had the Congress of Vienna, World War I, the Paris Peace Conference, World War II, Bretton Woods, the San Francisco Conference that established the UN, etc. A major war is something that we want to avoid. So if we need a world order, we need a method to get there that doesn't first involve or require a major global contest. And what Roderick and I have proposed is not a blueprint, it's not a design of a world order, but rather a meta-regime, a concept for how states and others could structure a continuing effort to build new rules, establish their legitimacy, and gradually build a greater sense of trust. Our idea is that states begin by agreeing to just something very simple. They agree to place issues into one of three broad categories without having to agree in advance which problems go in what category or what the specific arrangements within each category might be. Here's what I mean. First category would be prohibited actions. These are things states agreed amongst themselves not to do. The UN Charter already contains a number of these. One could easily imagine agreements not to engage in, say, beggar thy neighbor economic policies, or not to use nuclear weapons under any circumstances as well. So one set of categories, things we agree not to do to each other because we're both better off if all refrain from those activities. Second category, mutual adjustments. This is issues where states agree to adjust their behavior in exchange for reciprocal adjustments by others, leaving each better off. Trade negotiations are always like this. So are arms control agreements. In fact, you could argue that a lot of foreign policy, a lot of world politics involves this sort of compromise between states, where each agrees to adjust its behavior so that both are better off. So we're not proposing anything particularly radical here. Third category, independent action. If agreements or negotiations for mutual adjustments can't be reached, states, of course, retain the right, the ability to take independent action to protect their interests. But our proposal says these actions should have guardrails. You can act independently to protect a core interest, but not to deliberately harm another state's interests or to gain a unilateral advantage. For example, a state might bar the use of a foreign technology to protect its national security, as the United States has done with respect to Huawei 5G technology, but not for the purpose of destroying the company or to deliberately weaken China. That's an illustration of independent action, albeit with some guardrails. This scheme is agnostic about the precise content of the order that will emerge. Again, it's simply a method that could be used to begin a conversation among major powers and others. If you think about it, it's a bottom-up approach to order building that allows participants to state their preferences, but also to explain the reasons behind them, which is one way to help alleviate suspicion and build trust over time. And of course, if this effort succeeds and states abide by, say, the agreements in Category 1, are able to benefit from arrangements made in Category 2, and observe the guard rules that are involved in Category 3, over time the process can be a virtuous circle and more progress can be made. I think you can see some evidence of this effect in climate negotiations, which have made steady progress despite enormous obstacles. And you could even think of the nuclear agreement with Iran as an illustration of this sort of thing, even though it ultimately failed. Yes, it was involved mutual adjustments by both Iran and the other signatories to the agreement, and I think it's quite clear that the agreement actually made all of these countries better off. It was an enormous foreign policy blunder for the United States to abandon the agreement, as I think is increasingly clear as well. But again, that suggests that even very deep rivals like the United States and Iran can use a method like this to improve their security, particularly if they actually understand what it all means, which was not true, by the way, of the Trump administration. All right, so let me just wrap this up. Would this scheme work? I don't know. But I'm confident if we don't do something along these lines, the order that does emerge over the next few decades is going to be worse than the Cold War. Human beings around the world will be less secure and less prosperous than they would be otherwise. So to conclude, we are at one of these Gramscian moments when the old world is dying, the new world is struggling to be born. The bipolar Cold War order ended in 1992. The American attempt to construct a global liberal order was unsuccessful. Given the problems that are now bearing down upon mankind, it's tempting to be fatalistic and assume that a better world order will not emerge until we go through another catastrophic global upheaval. But we need not and should not accept that grim outcome. We can choose to be more optimistic. We can work collectively to develop norms, rules, and procedures that more accurately reflect the world of today and the needs of the future. Given those two alternatives, the right choice seems obvious to me. And while I would be happy to share those thoughts with America's next president, I suspect only one of the candidates would understand them or care. On that unhappy note, I want to thank you for listening, and I will now look forward to hearing Yvonne tell me why I'm wrong. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, and having injected so much optimism in the conversation, so it's right to have a Bulgarian as somebody to ask you questions. But my first question is, and this is something goes also to the elections, you say basically that the erosion of the order is simply change of the balance of powers, which is true. But I do believe when Donald Trump came as the president in 2016, he made a much stronger statement. He said the United States is becoming the biggest victim of this order. America is not a hegemon, America is a hostage. And he has certain arguments which were not necessarily wrong. So strangely enough, we end up in a situation in which not simply that nobody basically is ready to defend its order, but everybody is feeling as a victim of it. So secondly, when President Biden came to power, and particularly after Russia's invasion in Ukraine, he said, this is a great opportunity for everybody to understand that we should defend this liberal order, even those who does not like it much, because the alternative is disorder. And then you see others, India, South Africa, Brazil, they said, oh, disorder, But it was always like this. We never believed that there was much more order. You're seeing order from Washington, but basically we have been seeing quite a lot of disorder. And from this point of view, we're seeing this as a risk, but also as an opportunity. So in my view, one of the things that personally I was very much impressed is that in this period, it was not the Americans and the Chinese that are simply structuring the world. It was the hyperactivity of the middle powers. We see quite a lot of opportunity for them. Turkey, negotiating with everybody and everywhere. India, much more interested in the regional orders. So my first question is going to be, in order to have the type of conversations that you are talking about, we should share an idea of the crisis of order as a problem to all of us. And this is what I don't see. Because in my view, also in different traditions, and China is a great example of this, managing disorder is what is the name of the game. So to what extent your view, which is very much open to everybody else, is not rooted in the very much European-American idea that there should be a normative order, that should be spelled out, that should be deliberative, that should be inclusive, and to what extent it does not go with others who believe there was not much of an order anyway. There was a moment in which America really was very powerful, and they can do what they want, and we have to do and take care of this. But now we're in a world which is, of course, very dangerous, but we should take care of ourselves. So in a certain way, we're not ready for any type of big negotiations. We can negotiate different stories, but we're not going to this comprehensive idea. So is there demand for a new order, is my first question, and by whom?
That's a great question. I mean, there's a lot embedded in the preamble, so I want to address some of that as well. I agree entirely that given the situation we are in today, medium powers are maneuvering within the various power relationships that already exist, and it's not at all surprising. They are trying to gain advantages, playing both sides off against each other and looking for opportunities. I'm not sure that they prefer that situation, however, to one where there is a more stable or established order. They're simply making the best of a bad situation. And of course, none of these powers are likely to benefit if relations continue to deteriorate. Among other things, if you imagine a world where the United States and China get even more deeply in competition, right, they will both begin to insist that if you want to do business with one, you can't do business with the other. We will put enormous pressure on other countries, as we've done already in some cases, that if you're going to do business with us, you're not going to deal with Huawei, for example. We've done that with our allies. And of course, China will do the same to the extent that it can as well. That's a position that countries do not want to be in. Saudi Arabia does not want to have to choose between the United States and China. They would prefer a world where the level of competition is sufficiently muted that they can get benefits from both sides and occasionally extract concessions by threatening to move closer to one side or the other. I think that's the position that most of the medium powers are likely to be in. Europe is a slightly different case, it seems to me, in part because of the long-standing, very close ties with the United States, and because becoming less dependent on the United States has real consequences for European political economy, the nature of the European Union, et cetera. So I think they are more inclined to sort of favor the rules-based order that the Biden administration has tried to sell them. To get to your specific question, who's demanding this as well? In a sense, we, the United States, have been trying to insist that a established order would be good for everyone. The problem is that every time that order is inconvenient for us, we do something different, or we say it doesn't apply in this case, or we pretend that that rule really isn't there. And that's one of the reasons, as I suggested, that whatever consensus did exist until recently has broken down.
It's a great, and just on one issue, I very much agree with you that these middle powers, they don't want polarization. They don't want to go back to the Cold War. Right. But what is interesting is, if we're going to use a metaphor, in a certain way, the Cold War world was the world of Catholic marriage. You stay in one of the blocks and there is no divorce. But now they discovered something very important. In a certain way, sovereignty is much more defined as having different options than to belonging to a certain family. So kind of the world went on Tinder. You basically see Turkey, they want to be part of NATO. They don't want to leave NATO, but also want probably to have some talks with BRICS, and if they're going to be invited, want to go there too. In my view, this is the story why this level of disorder, which is not catastrophic, suddenly works for them. And my question is we not in a moment in which the United States and China do not have the power to impose this type of bipolarity which they really fear? For many reasons. Probably they can do it through technology. They cannot do it through ideology anymore. And I do believe this is very important because people, and particularly President Biden, was talking about democracy versus autocracy. Autocracy is not an ideology. Communism was. And there was many reasons for which, for example, very traditional governments in Africa, communism was really very much fearful because communism has two characteristics that were very radical. It was against God and against private property. Authoritarianism, in fact, all of them love God, starting with the Russian president these days. But in a certain way, there is nothing which is so fundamentally dividing. And this is why, in my view, this level of minimum order that you're talking about, what you're saying, for them in a way exists. Is it not what they're doing anyway? Basically, you're trying not to allow some major conflicts to happen. And then when they decide, and if they're powerful enough, they're going to break certain rules. And they're always going to claim that I'm not doing this for this my core security interest. So my real question is, to what extent what you're suggesting is, on one level, the idea of a post-American liberal order, or I mean, liberal order without American primacy, or to what extent basically is a simply high-graded version of the world which we have today?
I think what I'm talking about, what I think is most likely to result if this sort of scheme is used and things don't simply continue to deteriorate, is something that is certainly not a liberal order, but it is a more institutionalized form of great power competition in which that competition is kept within bounds. It looks a little bit more, say, like the Congress of Vienna, or the concert system, where you have states with different values within it, who have different domestic orders, etc., but they agree that they will manage their relations and that no actor will try it for more than the others are willing to accept, and they all mutually understand this, and then that gets institutionalized in specific agreements on trade, on investment, on weapons of mass destruction, including the use of force and things like that. So it's in a sense an order that recognizes there is a realist imperative for competition here, which, if not managed, if not given some guardrails, is likely to be very dangerous for everyone.
So two quick questions before going to you. And one is your question that you cannot not ask to a realist. All this starts with the assumptions that states are functional, well-organized, and they're basically dominating the game. But what we're seeing is, and we're talking about serious powers, we're not talking about failing states, which exist in many places. But the things that really struck me is very much something fundamentally has changed. One, of course, population is much more of a factor, and migration that you basically talk about, this is beyond state. This is not the state is sending people here and there. In a certain way, you have much more things, and the same is on the level of capital and business. So in a certain way, you have states which are much weaker than they pretend to be. But the thing that really kind of makes me nervous is that before, in the world that we're talking about, you have an external threat. And this external threat is going to produce a certain type of a national unity. You're going basically to reconcile with your domestic opponent because you're threatened from outside. I don't see this. I'm absolutely sure that the fact that you have a challenge, be from China, be from Russia, is not a reason for the American political leaders to have any level of reconciliation. So in a certain way, the real enemy is the domestic enemy. And in the democratic states, you see it. In my view, this makes this so difficult. Because if this is the case, if you have so much polarized society and state cannot produce this level of unity, this type of negotiations are going to be very different. Because, and this is why we're so much kind of thrilled to be on a night like this here. Every elections now in the United States starts to look like a regime change. How this type of a very volatile political system makes for this kind of an order to be sustainable?
I think, first of all, the volatility, as your question suggests, the volatility of today's political orders, particularly in democracies, has reflected the fact that we've lived through a period that was remarkably benign, right, where people genuinely believed that, great power war had been put away forever, right, that peace was going to spread, democracy was going to spread, markets were going to spread, we could all be individuals, live well, and not worry very much about security questions, except when we had to deal with a few relatively unimportant rogue states like Iraq or Libya or maybe North Korea as well. But everything else was going to really be pretty happy. And that, I think, allowed centrifugal forces of a variety of kinds to emerge in a variety of different ways. That said, I still think states are extraordinarily important, and I still think nationalism is an extremely powerful force. It has taken a different form in recent years, opposition to immigration and things like that, but it's there and easily tapped by political leaders. And when you see the Ukrainian response to Russians crossing their borders, to Vladimir Putin's great surprise, I think you see a manifestation of that. When you read the Chinese press and talk to Chinese about the power of nationalism within their sense of a genuine national narrative and a genuine national destiny that Xi Jinping, I think, has both taken advantage of, understood, and revved up in a variety of ways, I think it's not absent either. And as we were talking earlier this afternoon, I think this is the one thing that Donald Trump intuited or understood, was that nationalism was still a very powerful force in the United States, and he was better at speaking a nationalist rhetoric, make America great again, than any of his political opponents have been. I think it's been one of his secrets all along. Of course, he's not the only political leader who's done that, Viktor Orban being a famous example. Other populists tend to play the nationalism card as well. So I don't believe that I believe that then all you need to do to introduce, to bring back the kind of national unity one thinks of in earlier eras is the possibility that force might be used. And when people, I alluded to this, when people are insecure, they don't suddenly call up Tesla or Microsoft or Apple to protect them. Right? After 9/11, no one called Bill Gates and said, "Can you please help save us from Al-Qaeda?" They called the federal government. They wanted the federal government to protect them. And of course, the Bush administration then did that, not very effectively, but made the response. And I think that all it takes is to introduce the possibility that is a genuine enemy out there, not inside, but out there, to rekindle a great deal of national unity in many of the places where you see considerable division today.
Probably right on Tesla, but they can call Uber because they can decide to leave the place. And I'm saying this because this is one of the things that is happening, basically the exit option in which loyalty to the state has been changed. My last question is the one that I cannot, if I'm not going to ask, basically I'll end up in jail. But the story is people can imagine a different president being elected in the United States. From your view, where is really going to be the difference? Not for the America, but for the world. In this story about international order, what is the difference between Trump and Harris, keeping in mind that even if Harris is elected, the liberal order is not going to come back?
Yeah, I don't think you would see, well, let me put it this way. I don't think you'll see Harris engage in the sort of full-throated defense of the traditional transatlantic set of relations that Biden grew up with, believes in very powerfully as well. I don't think she thinks that's a bad thing, but she doesn't have the same emotional commitment to it that Biden has had as well. I also think that if she has been paying attention at all, she understands that if she is elected, she's going to inherit a couple of problems that will permanently handicap her presidency if they are not dealt with quickly. One is the Middle East, and the second one is Ukraine. And that's why I believe, regardless of the outcome of the election, the United States will beginning to move much more energetically to bring those two conflicts to an end. Right? And that will involve distancing the United States to some degree from Israel, and it will involve distancing the United States, or at least making it clear to Kyiv that it's time to end this, even if the terms are not ideal and not what their stated war aims are. Now, I believe a Trump presidency, it's much more likely that he would just walk away from Ukraine, not from Israel, but from Ukraine, in a precipitous way that would leave Ukraine in an even weaker position. I think she will handle it more responsibly, but she will try to do that quickly because she does not want to have to be wrestling with those two problems for the next 4 years, which is entirely possible as well, and would make it impossible, or at least much more difficult, for her to address any of the other issues she wants to try and deal with while she's president. In terms of other differences, I think they have fundamentally different approaches to American economic policy. If Trump is elected and does what he says he's going to do, we're talking about something that really is a return to the early 1930s in terms of levels of tariffs. It's conceivable this is all a bluff, that he's just doing this in order to get some concessions, but it's also entirely conceivable that he will try and do this, and this will have enormous consequences for the world economy and for the United States. It'll be horribly damaging to the American economy, which is why I cannot understand why people on Wall Street have any support for him at all. So that's one difference. In terms of China, both Harris and Trump are going to see China as a principal rival. They're going to want to focus a lot of attention on dealing with that, but they'll do it in very different ways. I think Harris would continue the most successful part of Biden's foreign policy, which has been building a set of, or strengthening a set of relationships in Asia, aided in no small part by heavy-handedness on China's part, which has made it much easier. And I think she would continue that. The problem with Trump is he would like to confront China, especially on trade, possibly on security, but he also wants to pick fights with South Korea and Japan and other countries, right? And these two things are completely contradictory. You can't get more allied support on security topics while you're trying to beat up their economies as well. So he, I think, would be a much less effective in dealing with problems in Asia. The final thing I'll just remind everybody is that Trump was actually fundamentally incompetent as a manager of American foreign policy during his first term. Right? Tom Friedman of the New York Times once said, it wasn't the art of the deal, it was the art of the giveaway. He gave Kim Jong-un of North Korea something extraordinarily valuable for Kim, the prestige of a summit meeting with the American president. Right? What did Trump get for that? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. He gave Benjamin Netanyahu everything Benjamin Netanyahu wanted, including moving the embassy, etc. Did he get any concessions? No, not a one. So this idea that Trump is this master negotiator who gets other countries to do things by being unpredictable, I think is dead wrong. And that was in an era where at least had some responsible people around to try and keep him within the lines. If, as we suspect, he would bring in a bunch of loyalists rather than a bunch of competent people to help him run foreign policy, I think you'll see another train wreck in a second term, which is, again, one of the reasons I wrote that column saying, you might think I would like a Trump candidacy for various reasons, but any kind of sober reflection would lead me to the opposite decision.
Thank you very much. So we go to your questions. But talking about Trump, one thing made a strong impression on me. There is a famous German sociologist from the 1970s, Nicholas Woolman, who had a very specific definition of power. And for him, power is the capacity to overthrow your problems on others. And when I was basically watching Trump, I had the feeling that he was a secret reader of Woolman.
Can I just comment on that? I mean, it's not that Trump was that way. That's the advantage the United States has always had. It's structural. Yeah. It's partly because the United States is so big and so powerful. So therefore, if it has an economic problem, as we did in the 1960s, we'll just go off the gold standard. The rest of you can deal with it, right? When the war in Vietnam doesn't go well, we finally decide to leave, and Vietnam can deal with those problems as well. Same thing is true in Afghanistan and elsewhere. And we're aided in no small part by the fact that the United States is over there in the Western Hemisphere, has extraordinary, innate, structural, free security. We have a wonderful neighbor to the north, hello, Michael, in the Canadians. We just don't face any really serious security problems close to home, which of course is why the United States can run around the world getting into trouble in lots of other places. We don't have to protect our own territory at all, and no other country is as fortunate as the United States is. Certainly no other great power is as fortunate. And that allows us to offload problems to others. I mean, it is kind of remarkable, just sorry to free associate here, but it is kind of remarkable that the Biden administration comes in, develops the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, which complete violation of World Trade Organization rules for subsidizing industries, and the Europeans basically accept it with some minor adjustments. And then we go around to high-tech industries in the Netherlands, in South Korea, and we say, by the way, we want you to conform to all of these rules and stop doing business with the Chinese, even though you're making lots of money doing that. And guess what? They go along. And that's not because Biden was such a brilliant strategist or read this author. It's because the United States is still in a remarkable position of
So
power.
now we all have the power. You can overthrow your problems on Steve has a question to him, please, and just introduce yourself, please.
Hello, everybody. I want to raise two questions. Can we create a better world order, and who is we? And who should decide what is the better order for all of us? It seems always from different perspectives, I think. US, China, and EU all set a series of key protective policies about technology and trade. Butterfly effect happened after the decisions from powerful countries. Especially nowadays, the battles and competitions are not likely the weapon war before. Thank you.
Thank you. The veil of ignorance.
Yeah, well, as I said, I think orders are fundamentally created by major powers because they are the ones who can enforce them, can impose their preferences on others, and can create arrangements that weaker states have little choice but to accept because being outside the arrangements is even worse, right? But particularly in today's world, there is, I think, no single power that can get all of its preferences, right? So if the United States says, well, we've got a blueprint and we insist that everybody follow it, it won't work, right? Other countries are capable enough now to either remain out of it or push back in a variety of ways. But that's also true of China. If China says, well, we have a vision for what the world order ought to be, and we demand that everyone accept our model, that won't work either because there are enough other consequential states who won't accept that. So this is going to involve a certain degree of compromise and a willingness of major powers to accept 70% of what they want, but not the 30%. And whether or not that willingness to compromise will exist over the next 10 or 20 years, I don't know. I am occasionally somewhat pessimistic about that as I see trends going forward. Second point I would make is remember, any order that gets created, it's a bunch of rules, right? It's a way of structuring relations and managing them. They are always imperfect. They always lead to unintended consequences. Things don't work quite the way you hoped, or they have, you learn 10 or 15 years later that they've led you someplace you didn't necessarily want to be, right? So the Bretton Woods International Economic Order worked really well for 15 years or so, and then it began to create problems for the United States, and the United States decided to change the rules. And that's true of most orders. The US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement was pretty good for a while, but eventually some new developments took place. It was obsolescent. It had to be reworked. So it's not like this process generates an outcome that then remains fixed for the next 100 years and everyone just, obeys the traffic laws. They require a certain amount of constant maintenance and adjustment, and the sort of meta regime that Danny and I developed accommodates that. There are some things that might be prohibited actions that people begin to say, well, maybe we want to be able to do that, right? There might be some things where there were mutual adjustments to the point that people say, we should codify that, make it a rule that we'll never do these sorts of things again. So we should be open to a certain amount of evolution over time, in any order.
Thank you very much. Michael Ignatieff. We're going to have all the questions, so.
I think everybody felt a kind of lift in looking at your and Danny's vision of a world order based on the prohibitive, mutual adjustment and definition of what the guardrails are in free action. And I guess my question is, how we get there in a little more detail. And I guess my question is really about how this looks to China. Presumably, an America in a Harris administration or some future administration feels there's a real need to put some guardrails, things we won't do, things that limit even our own freedom of action. What I'm not seeing is what your analysis of China is, because we've got a China that's lined up with Russia, with North Korea and Iran. One way to look at that axis of resistance is that it's insurgent against the existing world order. But if that's the case, then I'm trying to figure out why China would have an interest in the Walt Roderick rebuilding of an order. And I guess I'm asking you to think about how China sees the world here, how China faces the collapse of the order that they were parasitic on for 30, 40 years. I mean, they did very well under the American unilateral moment, in fact. Now they're looking at the slow decline of that. They've lined up with some people who are challenging the remnants of that order. So give me a picture of how China could be brought to work constructively with somebody. I mean, it might be the United States, it might be the BRICS, it might be the middle powers, it might be lots of people. How do you get China to play?
Okay. So I'd say several things in response to that. It's a great question. I mean, first of all, over the past 20 plus years or so, China has in some ways been more committed to the existing set of institutions than the United States has been. My colleague at Harvard, Ian Johnston, has actually written several great papers where he just sort of goes through the UN system, the World Trade Organization, this whole set of existing institutions. And the Chinese have been much more committed to these institutions and more willing to follow those rules than we have been. It's the United States, for example, that has blocked and effectively defanged the dispute resolution mechanism within the World Trade Organization. That was our doing, which renders much of the World Trade Organization's ability to enforce trade agreements, completely. It completely eviscerates that. And that was our doing, not Beijing's. So that's at least one reason to think that they might be interested in this. I think also that the broader question of Sino-American relations is another reason why Harris, if she's elected, would want to try and bring the conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East to an end, because they're actually quite disadvantageous to the United States in terms of dealing with China. It gives China a reason to move closer to Russia. It allows China to get cheap energy from Russia because Russia needs the revenues and has no leverage. And of course, it's a huge embarrassment to the United States to have the current policies we have towards the Middle East, which of course makes it much easier for China to walk around the world and saying, this is what happens when the United States tries to manage a particular region of the world. You get this. Shouldn't we have a world order in which power is shared and one country doesn't try to run everything? That's a great argument for the Chinese to make, and of course we've facilitated that. Why would they play? Well, first of all, their economy is in trouble too. And they are worried, I think, that a complete breakdown of the existing trading orders, the expansion of American economic sanctions, et cetera, will have a really debilitating effect. They would like to continue to get, have close economic ties to the United States, which of course is also what Apple and a whole series of other companies in the United States want to continue as well. But I think they do worry about that, and they understand that a complete breakdown of relations would be a problem. I think this is why you saw them make a serious effort to lower the temperature a couple of years ago when they saw where the Biden administration was going on all of this. And last point is that I do think one has to realize that China and the United States have been approaching foreign policy in a fundamentally different way for a long time. And I don't know how much longer that will last. The United States, as the leading world power for a long time, has gotten very accustomed to trying to manage lots of problems in lots of places. If something bad happens anywhere, we're almost certain to try and send somebody to try and do something about it. Not everywhere, but almost everywhere. We're constantly out there trying to run things or manage things. The Chinese have, by and large, stayed out of that business. As you said, they've been kind of parasitic or free-riding on American efforts. Their strategy is very different. We don't want to get involved in all those messy problems in different parts of the world. We don't want to spend any time, effort, or money on them. What we're going to do is spend all of our time pretending to be peace-loving, maybe we are peace-loving, but building up economic power at home and trying to have a commanding position in technologies we think are going to be absolutely central in the 21st century. That's what we're going to try to do. And then when we're in that position, we can start shaping the world order more directly without having to worry about challenges. We'll have the kind of leverage you Americans have had for a long time. That means staying out of trouble now and concentrating on building power at home. And I think that's a brilliant strategy for China. It's the strategy the United States followed in the 19th century, by the way. We stayed out of trouble everywhere and built the world's largest economy. And then we're in a position to start exerting greater global influence. Xi Jinping, I think, fatally erred by rushing the fences here, by beginning to declare Chinese ambitions and trying to advance those ambitions before they got all the way there. And I think that they now understand that they need to throttle back a little bit more and reaching agreements with other major powers that keep the lid on things and keep enough of an open world economy operating that they can continue to benefit from it would be in their interest.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move to another order. We're going to have several questions, and Misha is going to be first.
Steve, I just want to dig a little deeper on one of the things you said about if Trump comes in, he resolves Ukraine probably in a negative way for Ukraine very quickly, but that won't be the case in the Middle East. Since his last presidency, however, things in the Middle East have changed very dramatically, and his free ride for Netanyahu was posited on a deepening relationship between Saudi Arabia and Israel, UAE, and Israel as well. Because of Gaza, Mohammed bin Salman's room for maneuver on this now is much more limited. He's been talking to the Iranians. Iran has 90% enriched plutonium capacity and is close, if it wants to get a nuclear weapon, in large part because of Trump's decision to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal. So what has he got to play with there when Netanyahu has been the tail wagging the dog of the United States in spectacular fashion over the past year or so? How's he going to manage this?
There was a question there. Let's get 3 or 4 questions because otherwise people are not going. Please. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for coming and doing this talk. I'm with the Diplomatic Academy of Vienna, so I wanted to ask a diplomatic question. What institutions, forums, or other organizations do you think are best positioned to bring about this new world order that you were describing? As you said, the Security Council isn't really fit for purpose, and at each of these turning points, Vienna, Paris, San Francisco, a new organization was created. So is there something new that needs to be created, or is there an organization you see as best positioned for that? Thank you.
There was a question also back then, and then we're going to come to you and one more round. Yeah, please.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the talk and the distraction, as you said today. My question is about two ideas that can sometimes, to me, seem opposites. It's progressivism, progressive foreign policy, and realist foreign policy. And I would like to know your thoughts on how these two things kind of, how they overlap and how they differ. Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right, so, well, one of Donald Trump's great virtues has been unpredictability. So, you never quite know what he might do and how he would handle this. First of all, I don't think he has any personal feeling one way or the other about any of the parties there. It's not that he's fond of Israel or has a special bond with Mohammed bin Salman or cares really at all about how that part of the world gets dealt with. Well, it's why he offloaded the problem, right, to his lawyer, his real estate lawyer from New York, and his son-in-law in the first term, and that produced the Abraham Accords, which he thought was a great deal, and ignored all of the people who said, yeah, you've left one group out here, and that might actually matter, as indeed it has proven to be true. Now, on the other hand, we also know that he loves drama, and he loves attention, and he loves pretending that he's a great deal maker. So I could imagine him suddenly saying, all right, I'm going to work some magical deal here with Iran to restore relations and get them to back in the agreement. I alone can fix it, having screwed it up before, and maybe I can get the Saudis and the Israelis and everybody else. I can easily imagine him thinking that and imagining the reality show summit in which he would be able to be on screen and all the journalists in the world would show up to watch him meet the supreme leader the same way he met Kim Jong-un. What I don't believe is that he has the sustained attention or the ability to pick the right subordinates who could actually pull that off. Because to make something like that work actually requires lots of detail, right? The JCPOA was a very intricate arrangement, right? It wasn't a one-page memo that's the kind of thing that Trump would actually read. So you need people who are really skilled, competent, and knowledgeable to push something like that through. And I guarantee you there will be people like that on the other side negotiating this. So because he's such a terrible judge of talent and is going to be appointing loyalists, even if he wanted to move in that direction, I'm not confident he could get across the finish line as well. The question on the key institutions, I haven't thought a lot about this. I think it's often easier to tweak existing institutions than to create new ones out of whole cloth. I also think that this has to begin with building some bilateral and multilateral consensuses among key players and key actors. So the project that the Quincy Institute is putting together on a better world order has a whole proposal about reforming the UN Security Council, expanding the membership, slightly tweaking the rules on vetoes and things like that. If the United States and some others were willing to recognize that this would actually be good, that perhaps diluting some of the veto powers in order to reestablish the legitimacy of the Security Council itself would be a net positive. Then you could imagine a diplomatic process that actually might produce an outcome better than the one that prior attempts have reached as well. Great question on progressives versus realists or with realists. I have been to several meetings in the United States where it sort of brought what I would call sort of representatives of progressive foreign policy and representatives of realism or restraint into the same room. And it's fun to watch us interact with each other. And to a first approximation, I think there is profound agreement on one set of issues and then a departure on another. The place where there's profound agreement is that the United States should stop fighting stupid wars, right? And in particular should stop fighting stupid regime change wars because they don't work very well. And going along with that, we'd be better off if we were spending less on the military because we don't really need to, and we devoted some of that money to a variety of social purposes that progressives have a long list that they can then give you. And most of the realists I know, not all, but most would probably agree with that list. The big difference is there are two big differences. For some realists, not me, but for some, there also is a strong libertarian streak here, and for them, the progressive agenda is horrible because it's all about strengthening the state and doing various good things for people, and libertarians don't believe the state has any business doing good things for people, or much of anything else. But the other big difference is on human rights, where progressives are strongly committed to American power of different sorts being used to advance human rights around the world. And realists are, let's say, uncomfortable with that. They like the idea of human rights, but they see a very steep, slippery slope that once you start getting committed to that agenda, it's very hard to avoid suddenly finding yourself going into Iraq in order to help the beleaguered population of Iraq throw off a tyrant, right? And so if you start getting too serious about pushing human rights, you end up back in the kind of regime change wars that the United States shouldn't be engaged in. That's the place where you do get the heated discussions at these meetings. It's a coalition that agrees on a lot of things, but not on everything. Hope that was clear.
The last round of questions, please.
Thank you very much for the talk. How do you factor in deterritorialization of identity and ideology?
Can you say just another sentence or two about what you mean by that?
Yes, sure. So the scape that is beyond states or nationalities that has kind of collected groups alongside identity and ideology.
And one more, and then, and three, yeah, and then.
Okay, so, some of the world's, let's say, interesting leaders like Xi, Modi, Putin, Erdogan are in their 70s. What kind of leaders do you expect in the next 10 years?
Leaders in the 80s. Yeah, please. The last question.
Longevity is going up.
So I am so much thinking about also the questions you did and what Professor Krastev told us when he said, well, we don't only have to consider state actors, but also maybe corporations or neoliberalism in general. So I think the questions that we all are posing ourselves is, do they want an order, a kind of order? Because I think we, the people, somehow do feel the need to have an order, but does neoliberalism do or not? So when I think about that, I think when I studied international relations, I was educated with the principle that in general commerce moves nations to look for peace. This is what Montesquieu said. And when I think about how the European Union itself is moving, I somehow think it is true, because if you think as an example of why we have a conditionality mechanism that obliges member states to apply the rule of law, why do we have this? Because this is a way for investments to be sure that the rule of law works in every member state. So I think that somehow we can think of commerce or businesses as actors that do need an order, but I can also see that maybe neoliberalism exploits chaos better than order. And I think about the way they are trying to propose us insurances for climate change. So they created a problem, they are offering us a solution that is for profit. So I'm not sure that at the moment neoliberalism, for the way it works, really is moving for an order. I think they're exploiting chaos for the better. And I see the way we are also reacting to the crisis of globalization. This is protectionism. This is an unbalanced way to manage power. So do they want an order? I'm not sure about that.
Well, so those are three great questions. On the first one, I guess I'm a skeptic that the deterritorializing of the world is a very significant phenomenon. And this gets at a point you made about some people move. A remarkably small number of people as a percentage of the world's population actually live outside their countries of origin. The last time I looked, it's less than 1%. It's really vanishingly small. Most people end up staying pretty close to where they were born and grew up. Right? That's not true of most of the people in this room, right? The educated global elite, right? We wander all over the place. You leave Cambridge and you come to beautiful Vienna for a semester. But for most people, they are still staying at home. So I think that matters to some degree. And as I said, migration has had very profound political effects, but not because the number of people moving is so enormous, right, that it swamps the native population. It's just that it generates fears, concerns about the future, and things like that. So I may be wrong about that, but that's my basic take. It's just not that significant. I have not thought about the question of what will happen when all of these leaders in their 70s finally begin to depart the stage. I'm not yet 70 myself, barely. So it's not a question I really like to contemplate. But as a general rule, I think it's a bad thing for any organization to have the same person in charge for that long. It's bad for universities to have deans stay in power too long. I don't know, how long, Misha, have you had this job? Yeah, and you have to be a very, very unusual leader to sort of remain at the top of your game over 10 or 20 or 30 years. And of course, in order to stay in power, what you have to do is eliminate all the mechanisms of accountability that might exist. And once that happens, then you can do whatever you want and never be corrected, and you get collectivization of agriculture, you get the Great Leap Forward, you get all sorts of other disasters that unaccountable dictators have inflicted upon their countries. So the mere fact that you have all these leaders, Netanyahu in Israel, another one, been in power for far too long for various reasons. What happens when they leave? I don't know. I think part of it is you often don't have a good successor generation, right? You have the kind of leaders who took over from Stalin and had spent 20 years being, of course, terrified by Stalin as well. So you often get a successor that's not very good because they've never been given the chances to actually make any decisions really of their own. There is an article, which your question has made me want to go back and read, published back, I think, in the early 90s by Sam Huntington and maybe Dick Betts, called Dead Dictators and Rioting Mobs, which was all about the phenomenon you're talking about. What happens when leaders stay in power so long that basically it's the undertaker who takes them out of power, nothing else, and what happens subsequently. But I've forgotten what the main argument was. And then finally, this question about non-state actors in commerce. 2 quick points. This is a huge debate within the international relations field. To what extent does commerce have pacifying effects and really encourage states to remain at peace? I think it does, but it's not a 100% guarantee by any means, right? You can even make an argument that it's peace that causes interdependence more than interdependence causes peace. That states are willing to start, or companies are willing to invest and trade with others when they know they're not going to go to war with them. And they know that their investments are safe over there because there's a rule of law and there is a stable order. And once they begin to suspect that everything might break down for whatever set of reasons, then protectionism comes back. People are much more careful about where they're putting their investments as well. I think that also reinforces the point that private commerce likes order, likes rules. If you're a company, you don't have to negotiate your commercial agreements with some other country every other week. You want a stable set of rules. This is what the British didn't understand when they left the European Union. They were going to have to renegotiate the entire terms of their economic relationship, and that is a huge, enormous, time-consuming and inefficient task as well. Last point on this. Ian Bremmer of Eurasia Group and I had a nice debate a few years ago on this, where he had written an article in Foreign Affairs about the technopolar moment, arguing that big tech companies like Apple, like Meta, like others, were becoming like states, operating around the world, sovereign, uncontrollable, politically influential, indispensable in a variety of ways. And so the future world order would be one in which, yes, there are still nation states as well, but these big agglomerations of technology were going to be equally important. And I wrote a piece, Ian's a good friend, I wrote a piece saying he was wrong. And we then proceeded to go on podcasts and argue about it and had lots of fun doing it. If you're at all interested, you can find his piece in Foreign Affairs and my response in Foreign Policy. My main argument was, first of all, we've seen really big, powerful corporations in the past, right? Whether it's the British East India Company or U.S. Steel in its heyday, and ultimately they all succumbed to regulation by states, because companies operate in a legal and political environment that is ultimately set by states. And lastly, people, and it gets back to the point of nationalism, people are still willing to put their lives at risk for their nation, for their country. Nobody is willing to fight and die for Mark Zuckerberg, right, or Facebook, or any of these companies. And that ultimately matters if there's a contest between the two as well.
Wagner Group, you can die. Thank you so much. So now when you know what you did on November 5th, let's thank very much, Steve, for making this such an event.
Thank you.